We now continue with part two of Aristotle's Habit and Virtue. And last we met, we saw that Aristotle had provided a guide to moral education, and the essential idea is if you want to develop a virtue, say courage, you do courageous things. Or if you want to be generous, you do generous things. And this leads to the question of, if I'm trying to become more virtuous or avoid becoming more filled with vice, how do I tell when I'm making progress? And Aristotle's solution to this question, or answer to this question, is looking at pleasure and pain. And he considers pleasure and pain to be critical to ethics. So in terms of measurement of moral progress, or lack of progress, he takes the pleasure and pain that one feels as a good measure, a good index of progress. So the way one would tell, suppose you want to develop courage, if you found being brave more enjoyable and less painful, that would show progress. If someone wanted to become more generous, but they found that they weren't enjoying generosity, or they found that it was becoming more painful, that would show a lack of progress. He also believed that good conduct, behaving well, virtuously, involves having a proper attitude towards both pleasure and pain. So, for example, if you enjoy abstaining from pleasures, then you'd be temperate. If you find abstaining irksome, unpleasant, it would be licentious. In the case of less, kind of esoteric example, would be, facing danger. People who are brave are able to face danger gladly, or without at least too much distress or suffering. And of course, someone who's not brave, someone who's a coward, would feel very distressed, even by the slightest dangers. So, as a measure of moral progress, that's the test. And this is, he doesn't bring this analogy, but the obvious analogy would be to, exercise. The way you tell you're making progress, say at building strength, is that it hurts less to lift heavy objects, or making progress with running. That running is more enjoyable and hurts less. Now, in terms of how pleasure and pain also connect to goodness, virtue and vice, he believes that moral goodness, also it would follow that moral badness, is concerned with pleasure and pain. How so? Well, he notes, which seems correct, that pleasure can often lead people to behave badly. People can be, for example, people may be led to be greedy because of the pleasure of keeping the money for themselves. People can be, intemperate because of the enjoyment of, say, drinking too much or eating too much. And pain, he claims, leads us to avoid, what he calls fine actions, doing good. So if someone is, for example, afraid of actual physical pain, in the face of potential danger, then they'll be inclined not to do that, even when doing so, would be brave and heroic, like rescuing people, for example. He notes his teacher Plato that, that true education is being trained from infancy to feel joy and grief at the right things. And this, is something, as I mentioned in the previous video, that advertisers, political influencers, cult leaders, etc. have found out, that the earlier you can influence people and affect how they feel things, that becomes much more very effective. For example, tobacco companies generally aim at getting kids when they're young, not only to keep them customers alive longer because of the dangers of smoking, but also people form those habits and they're harder to break. Plato was aware of this, and Aristotle as well. They were more concerned with making people good as opposed to selling them dangerous products or getting them into a cult, etc. Now, he believes that every feeling we have, every action we take, would be accompanied by pleasure or pain. And because of this, virtue is concerned with both pleasure and pain. And in terms of, if we want to avoid being bad, we'd want to be aware of this, because he thinks people become bad because of pleasures and pain. How so? Well, essentially it's doing it wrong. He doesn't think that, pleasure is inherently good or pain inherently bad. It's how the context. So if someone avoids or seeks the wrong ones, or does so at the wrong time or in the wrong way, that's where things go bad. He doesn't think you should like always, seek out pain or always avoid pain. It depends is it the right, pain at the right time in the right way. So there may be cases where enduring the pain is, the path of virtue. For example, being brave in the face of danger in order to do, something right and heroic. And of course, the same with pleasures. We generally think of like seeking pleasures at the wrong times and the wrong way gets people in trouble, sometimes into the news, but also, it can also seeking pleasures at the right time in the right place in the right way can lead towards virtue, learning to enjoy, things that are improving. He claims there are three factors that lead us to choose things, to, select them. Being fine, not in the sense of like when people, say that fine type of thing, but fine as in like, good, excellent, as opposed to just fine, which often means adequate or not fine. The advantageous, because, well, the advantageous means it gives you an advantage. And of course, the pleasant. People tend to pick things that are fine in the good sense, the advantageous, and of course, things that are pleasant. And what we are led to avoid are things that are base, kind of like lowly and bad, things that are harmful, and things that are painful. So, two roles so far for pleasure and pain. One is index of progress. If you feel good doing good things and bad doing bad things, making progress. And also, of course, pain and pleasure can lead us to behave badly. So we have to be, watchful of those to avoid being misled by pleasure and pain. He also sees as a third function of pleasure and pain in ethics, he sees it as a standards of regulating actions. So feeling pleasure and pain rightly or wrongly will influence our conduct. If we feel pain at the wrong things or pleasure at the wrong things, we'll tend to behave badly. If we feel it correctly or right, we'll behave better. And again, Aristotle thinks that morality is objective, so he thinks there is, in fact, correct and incorrect ways to feel things people should feel pleasure and pain about. So just simply because something is pleasurable doesn't make it good for him, and simply because something is painful doesn't make it bad. And he thinks that these pleasure and pain should be a major focus of our inquiry into ethics. And he cites Heraclitus, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher. He's well known, in philosophy at least, for being the fire guy. He believed, or as far as we know, he believed that the world is metaphysically fire, both in the sense that it is composed of fire, it's the fundamental thing, all things are fire, and also in the sense that it's fire in that everything changes. His quotable quote is, "You can never step in the same river twice." The idea being that, everything changes. And Heraclitus said, at least attributed to him, is that it is hard to fight the emotions and even harder to fight pleasure. Aristotle takes a view that the harder course is always the concern of art and virtue because, and this is something that people can disagree with, but it is a not uncommon view that success is better in the face of difficulty. And this kind of points to an answer of, the classic question, why are good things often so difficult and bad things so easy? One answer might be, and Aristotle believed in a purposeful, teleological world, good things are difficult because success is better in the face of difficulty, supposedly. So both morality for him and political science are concerned and must be concerned with pleasure and pain, because if you treat pleasure and pain correctly, you will be good, and if you treat them wrongly, according to him, you'll be bad. Or so he claims. So those are the three primary roles for pleasure and pain in his theory. Index of progress, the influence they have upon us, and of course, that they're standards to regulate our actions. He then considers an objection, and then, of course, replies to it. And philosophers do this quite often, which can be sometimes confusing because when people are, say, doing politics or business plans, etc., trying to pitch or sell something, they generally don't consider objections to their view how they could be wrong. In fact, that can be seen as being weak or uncertain. But philosophers consider objections in part, to make their position stronger, because if you can bring up objections and reply to them, then of course you've dealt with them. And this can be advantageous because it's generally more effective to deal with problems when you're controlling them, as opposed to having them brought up by somebody else, because you're anticipating them. And you also, you're in control when you're replying to the objection you make yourself. You're in control of the objection and reply. And of course, doing philosophy, good philosophy, at least on my view and the view of some other philosophers, you should consider those objections and replies. Consider potential defects. So the objection he considers is this. So on his view, if you ask Aristotle, how do I become virtuous? And of course he won't answer because he's dead, but if he could give an answer, he would say, well, to become virtuous, you perform virtuous acts. To become brave, you do brave things. To become generous, you do generous things. And here is the objection that would be raised. If you're already doing what is virtuous, you're already virtuous. So this would seem to create a bit of a problem, which is if you have to do virtuous things to become virtuous, then you're already virtuous, so you don't have to become virtuous. But if you have to do virtuous things to become virtuous and you're not virtuous, you can't do virtuous things, so you won't become virtuous. So either you're already virtuous or you can't become virtuous. This is a circular regress, and one analogy to this would be the classic, if you have experience, that's the only way to get a job. And if you don't have a job, you can't get experience. If you don't have an experience, you can't get a job. So you could never get a job or experience. So this would seem to create a similar sort of circular regress. If you're not virtuous, you can't become virtuous. If you're already virtuous, you're virtuous. So there's no need to become virtuous. So how does he handle this? Because obviously he brings up the objection himself and doesn't just say, oops, I was wrong, I got to retool my whole theory. He has a response to it. So he draws an analogy, because of course he does. It would, like with music or, writing, like being literate. A similar question is to how do I become virtuous is how do I become literate, or how do I develop, a musical talent? So if somebody, we would say, of course, the way you become literate is by reading and writing. But then, of course, you could say, but if I can read and write, I'm already literate. And if I can't read or write, I can never become literate because I have to read or write to become literate. Or in the case of music, you'd say, well, if I have to play music to become musical, then I'm already musical. But if I'm not already musical, I can never be musical, so I can never play music. So how does he fix this? And obviously, he's got a solution, because otherwise he would say, oops, I'm wrong, and have a different view. So his first reply in the case of the arts is, this is not true in the arts. How so? Well, you could put together a few words correctly by accident or in another's prompting. Think of how, kids learn to read and write. Initially, of course, they can't, and then they start, developing, by prompting others, perhaps by accident, etc. And one is only literate if one does this in a literate way, in virtue of one's literacy. Now, in the case of the arts, Aristotle believed that, and this can be debated, of course, that works of art have merit in themselves, that it's enough to produce them with a certain quality. But virtuous acts, he thinks, they're not such that simply doing it makes them, have that, quality of being virtuous. So virtuous acts for him, if they're not done in a just or temperate way, they're not virtuous. They are merely because they have a certain quality does not mean, if they're done, temperately or justly, doesn't make them virtuous. So what's the difference? Well, he believes if you produce a work of art, that's the important thing. You just, if you get the result, that's what matters. But in the case of virtuous acts, it's not the result, It's these other factors that you have to be in a certain state. So what is the state that one must be in? Well, he claims that there are 3 requirements when one does something to make it a properly virtuous act. So the first thing is you got to know what you're doing. If one does not know what they're doing, acting out of ignorance, Aristotle thinks it would not be a virtuous action. To use perhaps a silly example, if someone is praised for running across the minefield to help someone, and someone says to them, "Hey, you're super brave. You're running across a minefield," and the person's like, "What mines?" And in that case, they don't know what they're doing. And then, of course, there's also the knowledge of engaging in and understanding what one is doing in terms of the activities. The second condition for him is that you choose to do the action and you choose it for its own sake. You take, for example, generosity. If someone is compelled to pay their taxes, they're not really being generous. Or if a business, by law, has to pay a certain amount of money, to in the form of taxes, or they're required to give a certain amount of their income to something, and because they're compelled, they're not generous. They're not choosing to do it, they're being compelled. And of course, they have to choose it, according to Aristotle, for its own sake. So if I'm giving money to somebody because I want to influence them, sway them, or convince people I'm a generous and good person, and that's my motivation, for Aristotle, that wouldn't be virtuous. Lastly, it's got to come from a fixed and permanent disposition. So not just a matter of luck or chance, it's got to be something that is, you may not always succeed at it, but it's fixed and permanent. And this is, we can say, is similar to skills in athletics. So the difference between someone making like a lucky shot in basketball and someone being consistently good, it doesn't mean they always make the shot, but it means they've got that skill. They can consistently, make shots. Or similarly, going back to the arts, like with in terms of like a skill, like drawing, they would have a skill they can consistently draw. But he's mostly focused on disposition, so having that right sort of character. So if I'm generous, it's not that I just, occasionally, like if I see a holiday special that, on that occasion I might give out, some extra money, and then the rest of the year I'm like really stingy. In that case, I wouldn't be generous. It's got to be something that's fixed and permanent, so that I'm consistently generous due to a disposition to be generous. So to go from simply like doing things that are, say, generous-like or courage-like, you got to know what you're doing, you got to choose to do it and do it for its own sake, and it's got to be a fixed and permanent disposition. In the case of the arts, he notes that you just have to know what you're doing. In the case of virtues, he thinks knowledge is not, a critical factor, and he thinks that the other two, namely, you choose to do it, choose it for its own sake, and develop that fixed and permanent disposition, that is the foundation of virtue. And so what occurs, he believes, is that you keep doing things, it's kind of like virtue-like, or kind of, courage, for a particular virtue like brave-like, and eventually you'd achieve it. And today, of course, we have an expression for this. It's called fake it until you make it. Or in Aristotle's case, it'd be kind of like fake it until you actually become real at it. So a person, trying to be brave initially, of course, might do hold the line, so to speak, like in a military situation, not because they're brave, but because they're being ordered to do so. They're not choosing it. They're not choosing it for its own sake, and they haven't developed the disposition, but they could want to, and so they keep sticking to it. And according to Aristotle, eventually they'll find that they'll be able to choose it for its own sake, and develop that disposition. A good example in the military would be how they put people through basic training. So they get them accustomed to the sounds of gunfire, etc., difficult situations, and so on. And the idea is that initially, if people don't have this disposition, they're forced to do it, by the sergeants, make them do it. And so they're forced into it, but eventually they can come to develop as a fixed and permanent disposition where they no longer have to be like threatened into, being brave. Like they can become brave, or at least courageous enough to not be frightened by, loud noises, hardships, etc. So that's how he thinks, his reply works. You start off doing things, to go back to the example of, music. Initially, of course, you can't play guitar, and what you're doing is doing like you're like playing guitar, trying to, and if you do it enough, eventually develop the skill. Same with virtue. Initially, one is not brave, one is doing brave-like things, but eventually one becomes brave. And he thinks that's how we can beat that objection. Next part of his reply is this. So we call actions just and temperate when they are such that a just and temperate person would do them in that way. So what makes a person just or temperate is not acting, but acting as a just and temperate person does. And so the idea is that we become virtuous by virtuous acts, and there's no likelihood that we become good, according to him, without doing them. And he draws an analogy to medicine, because of course he likes analogies. And the analogy is this. He notes that many people have recourse to principles in imagining they are philosophical, and so will become, good people, just by having, supposedly having principles or ethics, having values. And he says these are like people who are sick, who listen to a doctor but don't carry out their instructions. And just as the bodies of people who are sick don't benefit from just, listening to the doctor but not doing what they say, he claims that people who say read philosophy, read Aristotle, but don't put it into practice will get no benefit. And it seems like a pretty good analogy. If one has high blood pressure and the doctor says, you should change your diet, exercise more, etc. If a person says, oh, yes, those are great ideas, but then they don't do any of that, they're obviously not going to improve. So that's how he thinks he can beat this objection. Essentially, the idea is, as I noted before, the short version is fake it until you make it. Or in the case of Aristotle, fake it until you get it for real.